Hello friends, my name is JJ, and when I was cleaning out my apartment the other day, I came across this, the September of 2007 issue of The Beaver, which was devoted to figuring out who was the worst Canadian ever. The Beaver is a magazine that is put out by an outfit known as Canada's National History Society, or at least that's what their magazine used to be called. They changed the name to just Canada's History in 2010 because, and I swear I am not making this up, the title's inadvertently sexual connotation is getting caught in spam filters and preventing the publisher from reaching a new, life-sustaining generation of readers online. But anyway, in 2007, the Beaver did an online poll asking Canadians to nominate who they thought was the worst Canadian. They did this as a cheeky response to a 2004 poll that the CBC had done, asking who was the greatest Canadian, which was part of a fad that was sweeping the world at the time that I made a whole other video about. 15,000 Canadians voted in the Beaver poll, and the resulting top 10 list was kind of all over the place. The magazine itself admitted that their methodology exposed the perils of online polling, and thus, in an attempt at damage control, this issue not only discussed the public's top 10 list, but also looked at an alternative unranked list of 10 names of worst Canadians proposed by Canada's most renowned historians, as well as an additional 11 names proposed by the editors of the magazine itself. And today, in my ongoing effort to bring useful Canadian information to the masses, I thought we would take a look at this rogues gallery of the allegedly worst Canadians of all time and see what sort of conclusions we can draw about the sort of people that Canadians hate. But before we get to that, let us just hear a brief word from today's video sponsor, Surfshark. Hello friends. So in the course of making the highest quality videos I can for you guys, I often buy pictures online, usually from websites that specialize in news or historic photographs. And one thing I have noticed about these sites is that their prices and selection tend to vary a great deal based on where you're shopping from. For example, sometimes a photo that I really want isn't available in Canada, or if it is, they charge you way more than they would if I was from, say, South Africa. And this isn't just the case with photographs either. You would be surprised how often the selection and price of stuff that you buy online varies depending on where the site thinks you're shopping from. And I know all of this because I am such an active user of today's video sponsor, Surfshark. Surfshark is an app that allows you to use a virtual private network to fool the internet into thinking you're in a different country than you actually are. With over 3,200 servers in over 100 countries, there's no limit to where you can pretend to be from. And using Surfshark is valuable for all sorts of other reasons too. Its VPN service provides an additional layer of security when you are using public Wi-Fi, as well as preventing your personal activity from being tracked or recorded when you surf the web. Surfshark is also the most affordable of the big three VPN providers, and best of all, it is award-winning. If you sign up for a 12-month or more plan using the URL surfshark.com/JJMCC, or click on the link in the thing below, fans of this channel can get an amazing extra 4 months absolutely free. And remember, with Surfshark, there is always a 30-day money-back guarantee. So don't get left out in the cold like this guy. Give Surfshark a try today. Surfshark, VPN made easy. Okay, so overall, the Worst Canadians issue features a total of 31 names, and they broadly fit into 6 categories: killers, traitors, politicians, media barons, people associated with the persecution of the Native Canadians, and weirdly enough, singers. The public poll is where the 2 singers can be found. In the number 2 spot, we have Chris Hanna, who you can be excused of never having heard of. He is a punk rock musician from Winnipeg who purposely rallied his fans to flood the Beaver poll and vote for him as a publicity stunt, which I guess worked because here I am still talking about him. Chris is the lead singer of a band called Propagandy, which according to my punk rock expert YouTuber pal Dan Frampton, were important from a Canadian perspective.
But as far as punk bands in general go, they'd be lucky to crack the top 100.
The other singer in the public's number 7 spot is Celine Dion, who is obviously one of the most famous Canadians of all time and one of the great power ballad divas of the modern age. But a lot of Canadians have also always found her overhyped and annoying, and resent her being the face of this country to the world. Now, the two media barons on this list are interesting. The first one, in the public's number 10 spot, is Conrad Black. Conrad Black is a wealthy Anglo-Quebecer who became famous in the 80s and 90s as a prolific purchaser of newspapers around the world, mostly conservative-leaning ones. He also founded the National Post, which is considered Canada's respectable right-of-center paper of record. He is a pretty conservative pundit and writer himself, and in recent decades, I feel like this is what he's primarily known for. He is one of these unapologetically elitist types of conservatives with a pompous manner that can really grind on people.
Hollywood, professional sport, and frankly, urban agitating groups masquerading as crusaders for civil rights, but as we saw through much of the summer, rather more interested in vandalism.
And his grandiosity led to a big scandal in the late 90s, where he renounced his Canadian citizenship so he could get appointed to the British House of Lords. This was a huge blow to his reputation because it seemed so brazenly unpatriotic. And certainly circa 2007, it would have been something that a lot of Canadians would still resent him for. The other media baron is Lord Beaverbrook, who is on the professional historians list. I feel like Lord Beaverbrook is much more of a British historical figure than a Canadian one, given that he moved to England in his 30s and lived there for the rest of his life. He is considered one of the founding fathers of British tabloid culture and was quite a conservative guy himself, serving for a time as a Tory politician in the British Parliament.
Rest assured that in the British Empire at any rate, we will enjoy once more the prosperity which the people so earnestly desire.
Probably the worst thing that you could say about him from a Canadian perspective was that he turned his back on this country. And indeed, the magazine says, except for morsels of patronage tossed to New Brunswick, which is where he was from, he contributed little else to the improvement of Canada. Which leads us to the second category, the Traitors. The professional historians list contains 3 men who are known for betraying Canada in various ways. The first is Adrien Arcand, who was the head of a pro-Nazi fascist movement in Quebec in the lead up to World War II. So there was a fair bit of sympathy for the Nazis, and especially Mussolini in Quebec in the 30s and 40s, given that Quebec was a very conservative, nationalistic, and Catholic place in those days, and fascism tended to thrive in those sorts of conditions. The degree that the province's conservative establishment, up to and including the ruling Conservative Party itself, sought to ally with Arcand during the height of his fame, remains a very shameful episode of Canadian history. Kano Inoue was a Japanese Canadian who defected to Japan during World War II and served as a sadistic prison guard at one of Japan's notorious POW camps. He was eventually captured by the British and was tried and executed for treason after the war. In contrast to those two, whose betrayal of Canada is pretty undebatable, we also have John Christopher Reifenstein. He is a very obscure and quite morally ambiguous figure associated with the War of 1812, which was a conflict between the US and Britain for control of this continent. At one time, the 1812 War was considered like this really important event in Canadian history that everybody was supposed to know a ton of stuff about, but I don't think anybody really cares that much anymore. Anyway, Reifenstein was a military guy serving on the British side. He was present at the Battle of Moraviantown, but left early and proceeded to spread misinformation to his superiors back at the base about what had happened there. And apparently this contributed to confusion on the British side, which hurt their strategy and I guess contributed to their inability to reconquer America. And for that, he is apparently one of the worst Canadians in history. All right, the next category of bad Canadians are bad politicians, who are well represented in all 3 lists. The vast majority of these guys are former prime ministers. In fact, of the 22 prime ministers that Canada had up until that point, 7, or about a third of them, made the cut. Now, on the public list, it is pretty obvious that these people are just here because of partisanship and recency bias. The public's number 1 pick is former Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, for instance. He was a complex guy who did a lot of stuff during his 15 years in power, which lasted from the 60s to the 80s, but was also deeply reviled by Canadian conservatives who saw him as this crazy socialist. The reverse is true for Brian Mulrooney, the public's number 4 pick, who ran Canada during the 80s and was extremely hated by the Canadian left. And then we have 90s era Liberal Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, and then current Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who had only been elected a year and a half ago. I feel like it's pretty clear what's going on here, so we won't do any deep analysis. That's politics, baby. On the editors list, meanwhile, they have Arthur Mahan, who briefly served as Prime Minister in the 1920s, but had a more substantial political career as a right-wing cabinet minister in the 1910s. The editors blame him for the brutal tactics that the government employed, breaking up the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919, which is often seen as one of the worst crimes against organized labor in this country. On the historians list, they offer 2 more prime ministers. The first is John Diefenbaker, who ruled Canada from 1957 to 1963. The description just describes him as a basically incompetent prime minister who didn't do much in office, which is probably fair. People will defend Diefenbaker as a, well-meaning guy, but it is hard to argue that his time in office was anything but troubled and inconsequential. Whether that makes him one of the worst Canadians of all time, however, I would argue is a bit of a stretch. And then there is Sir John A. Macdonald, Canada's very first Prime Minister. At one time, Macdonald was a very venerated figure in Canada. In fact, he was ranked by the public as the 8th best Canadian of all time in the CBC 2004 poll. He has been traditionally understood as Canada's George Washington, the architect of the Canadian Constitution, and the man responsible for expanding a small collection of British colonies on the east coast of North America into a mighty nation occupying the entire top half of this continent. These days, however, he has become a much more controversial figure for the toll that the annexation of all of this land had on its Indigenous residents, the people who never asked to be part of Canada, but Macdonald's government nevertheless felt entitled to conquer, rule, and assimilate through a variety of heavy-handed tactics and policies during his long time in charge. But even if we agree that his policies towards the Indians were unjustified, the counter-argument would be that he still played an enormous role in making Canada happen at all. So unless we believe that the creation of Canada was a net negative, it's hard to declare him the worst Canadian of all. Moving on from the prime ministers, the historians list has Sam Hughes as another bad Canadian politician. Sam Hughes was the defense minister of Canada during World War I. He was this eccentric and flamboyant figure who was widely blamed for badly mismanaging Canada's war strategy in the first couple of years. His vanity, corruption, and general incompetence was blamed for unnecessarily high Canadian battlefield deaths, particularly at the Battle of Ypres, where 6,000 Canadians were killed. As the war grew less popular, Hughes became an increasingly despised figure, and his firing by the Prime Minister in 1916 is seen as a turning point in bringing saner leadership to what is now remembered as one of Canada's prouder wars. On the Beaver's editors list, they have Robert Monckton. He was part of the 18th century British warlord class who ran the Atlantic provinces of Canada after they were conquered from the French in 1712. He is associated with leading the initiative to forcibly expel all of the French settlers, known as Acadians, out of Atlantic Canada and into Louisiana in order to make room for British settlers. To this day, this is remembered as a pretty vile episode of what we would now call ethnic cleansing. On a lighter note, the Beaver editors also nominate Thomas White, who was Canada's finance minister during World War I. Because the war was extraordinarily expensive, the government introduced a temporary tax on incomes in 1917. So now you know who to thank for that. All right, so the next category of person sort of builds on what we were discussing with Macdonald. These are men associated with the abuse of the Native Canadians, what some people would call the genocide, or at least attempted genocide of the Indigenous peoples of Canada. Lord Edward Cornwallis was an early British governor of Nova Scotia following the conquest of Atlantic Canada, and the founder of the city of Halifax. He is also associated with leading an active effort to purge the region of its remaining native inhabitants, culminating in a so-called scalping bounty wherein white settlers were just straight up paid by the government to kill Indians. Lord Geoffrey Amherst was the first British governor of Quebec, following its conquest by the British in 1760. He is also one of several British military men of the time who is on the record musing about giving smallpox-infected blankets to the Indians. John Schultz was a powerful political leader in late 19th century Manitoba. He was associated with leading the Western Territories' growing population of white settlers in opposition to what was then a very large population of Indigenous and mixed race or Métis people. He held a number of prominent political offices in which he consistently advocated for this rural territory to be fully subsumed, absorbed, and assimilated into white Christian Canada, which is more or less what happened. Nicholas Flood Davin was a similar sort of man, a powerful 19th century politician in the Western Territory of Saskatchewan, who was a big advocate of pacifying and assimilating the native population. In 1879, he was commissioned by the Macdonald administration to write what became known as the Davin Report, which advocated for Canada to double down on assimilating and Christianizing Indian children through a system of state-subsidized boarding schools, which are today widely condemned as one of the most destructive and immoral initiatives in Canadian history. Joseph Trutch, meanwhile, was the colonial governor of British Columbia in the late 19th century, and he was, once again, a figure associated with actively encouraging the displacement of the native peoples in one of the major Western territories of Canada. He is actually considered pretty extreme even by the standards of his time, since he didn't even believe in signing treaties of surrender with the Indian leaders, just flooding their lands with settlers and expecting them to accept it. And this created an unusual legal situation in British Columbia that persists even now, where many native leaders argue that a lack of treaties means that they are still technically the legal owners of the province. Duncan Campbell Scott was a famous Canadian poet in the early 20th century, but these days he has become increasingly taboo because of his job as a senior federal bureaucrat in charge of Indian affairs. And there's not much more I can say as far as that goes. From the late 19th century to the 1930s, he helped consolidate a national Indian policy based around displacement and assimilation. He is quite notorious just because, as a writer, he was very articulate in describing the intention of Canada's assimilation policies. All right, so that is that lot. But the next category is even grimmer. It is just Canadian mass murderers. I don't want to dwell too much on these people because they're just a bunch of twisted sociopaths who killed a bunch of people. But they're still quite famous figures in Canadian history just because of the sheer horror of their crimes. On the public's list, we have Clifford Olson, who was a 70s era serial killer from British Columbia, as well as Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka, the so-called Ken and Barbie killers, who were a notorious serial killer couple from the 1990s. The editor's list has Alexander Keith Jr., who was the wealthy scion of a famous Nova Scotia liquor dynasty. In 1875, as part of a botched attempt to blow up a cargo ship for insurance fraud, he brought a powerful bomb to a shipping dock in Germany that wound up exploding prematurely, killing 81 innocent people. The infamous Mad Trapper of Rat River is a somewhat less serious figure. He was this weird recluse who lived up in the Arctic in the 1930s and wound up triggering this dramatic 5-week manhunt after he shot a Mountie who had come by his cabin. Though he wound up shooting 2 other cops in the course of his run from the law, he only killed one of them, making it a bit of a stretch to call him Canada's worst person, though he is certainly one of the most famous criminals in Canadian history. All right, and now let us burn through a couple of the miscellaneous characters that round out the lists, but cannot be easily characterized into one of these previous categories. Henry Morgentaler is in 3rd place on the public list. He was an abortion doctor in Quebec in the 1980s, at a time when abortion was only legal in Canada when the mother's health was in danger. Morgentaler defied these laws, and his case wound up going before the Supreme Court, who, in 1988, ruled that Canada's existing abortion laws were unconstitutional, and this ushered in an era of unregulated abortion access in Canada that continues to this day. And for this reason, Dr. Morgentaler is a deeply hated figure among Canadian pro-lifers. On the editor's list, we have E. Stone Wiggins. He was a man from Ottawa who enjoyed a brief moment of fame in the Victorian era for his dramatic, confident claims of being able to predict big storms and earthquakes using various forms of crackpot junk science. He was never right, of course, and eventually became a subject of ridicule and scorn, and is now probably Canada's most notable contribution to the golden age of 19th century cranks. Arthur Ellis, meanwhile, was the pseudonym of a mysterious guy who served as Canada's leading hangman during the early 20th century. He was this dark and ghoulish little man who became a subject of lurid fascination because of his creepy professionalism at a time when hangings were still open to the public. He presided over hundreds of executions without error, but then horribly botched one in 1935 in a truly gruesome way. And that was the end of public executions. And lastly, we got Edward Ferrer on the historians list. He was a prominent journalist and essayist in the late 19th century who was very anti-Quebec and pro-America, and often suggested that Canada would be better off ditching the British Crown and joining the United States. And truly, who could imagine such a monster? So, what can we conclude from these lists? Is there any sort of consensus as to what sort of person makes for the worst Canadian? As I said earlier, the public list definitely suffers from partisanship and recency bias, as well as a bias towards conflating annoying to me with objectively bad. But at the same time, with some of their other picks, the public clearly takes the title of worst extremely literally and assumes that the worst Canadian is literally just the Canadian who killed the most people with his bare hands. The academics list, meanwhile, is biased in the way that we might expect the work of professional historians to be, which is to say it includes a lot of relatively obscure historical figures who are judged for the degree that they failed to meet the challenges of their particular historical moment, but weren't necessarily terrible at a particularly epic scale. And then the editor's list feels quite politically correct in the sense of putting a lot of emphasis on Canadians who were bad primarily because they were motivated by the ignorant prejudices of the past, supplemented by a few goofier characters that flex knowledge of historical trivia. As we saw, the lists of the editors and the historians also put a lot of emphasis on highlighting the persecution of the Native Canadians, which foreshadowed the moment that Canada is in now, where the topic of Indigenous genocide is constantly emphasized in Canadian politics and the media as the defining evil of Canada's past. So, now I will turn it over to you. Who would you pick as the worst Canadian ever? And if you don't know much about Canadian history or are not Canadian yourself, let me know if your country has someone who is widely known for being the worst person your nation has ever produced. Maybe the Germans can sit this one out. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week.